So this is a video that I'm going to call the Historocity of the Gospel. And the basic point of this video is just to go over what actually happened in the first century in Jerusalem, what we know happened and what we can infer from what happened, and also to go over some possible alternative explanations that have been put forward and why they don't hold up. So, just for the start, there are some things that we do know for sure actually happened. We do know that Jesus Christ was a man who actually lived. We do know that Jesus Christ was an itinerant preacher. We do know that the Jewish authorities hated him and condemned him to death. We do know that he was crucified on a Roman cross, and we do know that he was buried in a tomb. We also know, through both Christian sources and Jewish opposition sources, that the tomb was found empty after that. So we do know that Jesus lived, we do know that he died, we do know that he was buried, and we do know that eventually his tomb was found to be empty. So there are a couple of different possibilities that one can go through with this. One of them is that the one that we'll just go with what the opposition said. The Jewish authorities claimed that the disciples stole the body. But if you actually consider what happened after that and subsequent to when they supposedly stole the body, you have to really consider, because they actually went out and claimed that they had seen him risen from the dead. Under torture, beatings, and execution, they refused to recant of that statement. They claimed emphatically, to the moment of death by torture, that they had seen the risen Christ. If they had been lying, it's pretty likely that they wouldn't have died for that, if they knew for a fact that Jesus had not actually risen from the dead. Nobody is going to go and get themselves tortured to death or stoned to death or anything like this for something that they know for a fact is false. So that's a little bit ridiculous, and one also has to account for something else by that point. The Apostle Paul, then called Saul of Tarsus, was going about essentially getting the Christians killed and arresting them and imprisoning them and compelling them to blaspheme. That was his own phrase for it. And then, one day on the road to Damascus, he claims that he saw the risen Christ himself. Now, this is a man who was making it his life's work to destroy the Christian church in its earliest days. What possible reason would he have to leave a life of promise, a life of essentially, especially compared to the Christians at that time, luxury? He was a respected person in the religious establishment, and then he went out of his way to give all of that up and then claim that he saw Jesus rise from the dead. So exactly what purpose would he have to be lying about that when all it got him was persecution, arrest, and eventual execution? It's fairly an untenable explanation, so we can fairly easily assume, okay, the disciples didn't steal the body. That doesn't actually hold any logical water. The next possibility is that the disciples hallucinated the risen Christ. However, one still has to account for the empty tomb, because both sides claim the tomb was empty. So if the disciples hallucinated the risen Christ, then what happened to the body? Who took it or moved it? What went on with that? Because all it would take to disprove the claims of people who had hallucinated that Jesus had risen from the grave would be for the Roman or Jewish authorities to just go to the tomb, open it up, take out the body, and parade it around the streets and say, hey, look, he's still dead. We know that for sure. So even if one was to claim that the disciples actually believed they had seen the risen Christ, one would have to assume that either somebody else who was not one of the disciples stole the body. This one, by the way, also would not account for Saul of Tarsus either, because that would require that he hallucinated the risen Christ on the road to Damascus while still going on the road to Damascus to go and imprison and persecute and kill Christians. that really doesn't make any sense in and of itself. That one example is almost enough to dismiss this whole thing. And then another possibility for them to have thought that they saw the risen Christ would be what is called the swoon theory, which is essentially Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, but that he appeared to be dead, and so they buried him as if he was dead anyway, but he actually wasn't dead, and then he woke up, and then he went out of the tomb, and then that was why people thought that he was risen from the dead. There are some very serious problems with this one, however, as well, because if we actually consider what happened to Jesus, he was scourged within an inch of his life, so his body was torn to strips before he was ever even put onto that cross. He was beaten. He was forced to carry his own heavy cross until he either dropped it or collapsed. We're not 100% sure, and someone else carried it the rest of the way. He was crucified, so nails essentially the size of railroad spikes driven through his wrists and ankles. So he's bleeding from an enormous number of places all over his body. He's under enormous amounts of stress and shock and blood loss and all kinds of things like this. And then when he fainted or swooned, as this theory puts forth, he was then stabbed in the chest by a Roman centurion. Like, legit in the chest, between the ribs kind of thing, as a means to make absolutely certain that he was actually dead. So then you have a person who has endured all of this, who is wrapped in around or more 75 pounds-ish, between 75 and somewhat more pounds of not just burial wrappings, but burial spices. So he's tied up in all of this, fairly heavy when you actually consider it overall. And then he's placed into a tomb, unconscious, bleeding, receiving absolutely no medical attention of any kind. And then in this tomb, a giant rock is placed over the top. It's placed over the entrance to the sepulcher. And so then you have a person who somehow doesn't die from blood loss or shock, somehow doesn't get smothered by the burial wrappings in a closed tomb with very poor air circulation, if any at all, who then not only survives this, but manages to wake up 3 days later, get himself out of his burial wrappings, move a stone slab that probably took several guys to put in place in the first place. And again, I need to stress the fact, this is a man who was brutally tortured essentially for an entire day before being stabbed in the chest and buried. Moves a giant stone slab, and then, because the Roman authorities and the Jewish authorities wanted to make absolutely certain that nobody could steal the body, there were soldiers outside of the tomb making sure that no one came to steal the body. So then this person, who's been brutally tortured, would have to be disoriented in so many ridiculous ways that it's not even funny. Then, after moving this giant slab by himself, without being noticed by the Roman authorities, then sneaks past the Roman soldiers who are guarding his very own tomb, and then goes back into town, walking on feet that again have the heels pierced through by a nail the size of a railroad spike, and he's walking into Jerusalem. And he's still walking the same day as his supposed resurrection. He's walking not just into Jerusalem itself, but between cities that are what was called a Sabbath day's journey apart, and he's walking along with his disciples. About midway there, he meets up with them and then walks with them the rest of the way to this other city. And he's walking. I need to stress this again. I cannot stress this enough. If you got stabbed all the way through from the front of both of your feet through the backs of your heels, is it really tenable to think that you would be able to be walking along the road and for people to not recognize, one, that something horrible happened to you, and two, that it was Jesus Christ who was just crucified a couple of days ago as a public spectacle for the entire city to watch? the idea of him enduring this, somehow swooning and then climbing out of his grave and then not being noticed by anybody except his disciples, is insane. So this one, I actually want to apologize for that. I don't want to say it. It's a little bit ridiculous, is all I'm trying to say. Then the next possible... Well, actually, now that I think about it... No, I think that covers the only possibilities that there are other than Jesus actually rose from the dead. And Jesus actually rising from the dead accounts for the fact that all of the apostles claimed that they had seen him rise from the dead. It accounts for the fact that the tomb was empty. It accounts for the fact that the apostles all died, except for, I think, John. I don't think John died under torture, but he was still tortured. So all of them endured torture. Most of them endured execution, affirming it because they believed it and they'd actually seen the risen Jesus. Saul of Tarsus converts because he actually saw the risen Jesus, and etc., etc., etc. This fits all the facts. The other ones run into so many contradictions that they're really untenable as explanations. And another thing that I had heard just today, and I want to say thank the Lord for this, because this was an explanation that I hadn't actually considered before, but basically, somebody said to me that the explanation for all of these things is that all of the writings and accounts of this were written centuries later, and so the apostles didn't even actually have to have even existed, much less died for their faith. This is problematic in other ways, however, because if you want to say that these were all written centuries later and none of these accounts actually happened, you have to account for the fact that the Christian church, you're now saying, began centuries after what is manifestly, obviously, its actual origin date. Because if you say centuries later the Christian writings began being written, you have to claim that centuries later the Christian church actually started. It's a historical fact that the Christian church did not start centuries after the events. There is such a thing as the first century church. You can actually go and find the tombs of people who were bishops in the first century church. Lazarus, who Jesus raised from the dead, was a bishop in the first century church. You can actually go and find his tomb, and it's pretty explicitly stated that he's a bishop of the first century church there. And the preponderance of evidence that the Christian church actually started in the first century is overwhelming. So to say that all of this stuff was written centuries later is kind of untenable as any kind of explanation for absolutely anything. It causes you more problems than you would want to admit, because then you have to admit that centuries later, people who are actually probably still being persecuted by the Romans at this point are going back to change history, to invent their own creation and say that, oh no, this religion didn't start now, it actually started 200 years ago, and then just have nobody, and it was like a huge thing for that whole 200 years, and then to have nobody question that, and nobody say, well, no, that didn't happen, there was no Christian church 200 years ago. The Christian church started yesterday in that back alley over there, because we know that those guys were the ones who started it, because they started writing out all this propaganda and saying that Christ was this person who rose from the dead. Not to mention the fact that the Roman and Jewish authorities admit to the crucifixion, they admit to the empty tomb, and therefore kind of by proxy admit to his disciples and everything like that. This was a debate that was going on for centuries by the time you're now claiming that these writings and witness accounts and testimonies are suddenly being fabricated. That it couldn't have happened that way by definition. Just logically. Anyway, I feel like I went on sort of a rant there, but thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a very blessed day. And, enjoy yourselves. I hope you'll all come to Christ, and I hope that if you are a Christian, this has provided you with a little bit of help and something to strengthen your faith. Anyway, God bless.